Hey guys, hope you're doing well and are excited to get back to learning about microeconomics and are ready to continue with the topic of elasticity and the demand curve and getting ready to conclude this chapter on consumer behavior. So let's go back to the scenario we had. You owned a local bakery, you're producing some things and you're selling them, and you're considering, because your costs are rising, you are considering raising your price of those products. And the question was, the demand curve tells us that if you raise your price, you will sell fewer units of that commodity. So in this case, whether you're looking at cakes or whatever baked goods you're selling. We've talked about how many fewer units you will sell is told to us by elasticity. So make sure you're comfortable with the demand, how to represent the elasticity on a demand curve, whether the line is flat or steep, and also theoretically and numerically what it means to calculate the number for elasticity. If you're not comfortable, go look at the video that's popped up on the top right of your screen and review that video and come back here. Now what we're going to talk about in this video is how does that change your revenue, right? So first let's define what revenue is and then we'll get to answering that question. So total revenue is the amount paid by buyers, that's us, consumers, to sellers. We haven't talked too much about sellers. That's going to be the next chapter. We're going to talk a lot about sellers in the next chapter based on what they sell, right? So they charge us a price, they sell us a particular quantity, and the price times the quantity they sell us is the revenue they generate. So if they're selling 5 cakes, for example, and they charge $10 per cake, the total revenue is $10 per cake times 5 cakes, which is $50. So that's how, whenever I use the word total revenue or total spending or total expenditure, I'm referring to P times Q of a particular commodity. Right, so hopefully that's clear for you. Now let's look at the demand curve that we've drawn many times. We have quantity on the x-axis, price on the vertical axis, and let's say the current amount and price that we are charging and selling is $4 and we are selling 100 units. So tell me, what do you think is going to be your total revenue if you are selling this combination of whatever the commodity is? You're right, the price you're charging is $4, the quantity you're selling is 100, so total revenue for the seller is 4 times 100, which is $400. So keep this area in mind, because now when I talk about elasticity and how the revenue changes with elasticity, you need to be very clear on what and how you measure total revenue. All right, so hopefully that's clear. And now we get back to the question of your baker trying to raise the price, is that if you raise your price from $200 to $250, whatever it is you're selling, what will happen to your revenue? And we're going to ask this question, what happens when I increase price? So you'll see that there's going to be 2 opposing effects. When you increase price, you will charge a higher price to people who are buying your commodity. However, the law of demand tells us that if I charge a higher price, I'm going to sell fewer units because some people will not buy the good. So you are going to have 2 opposing effects, that your revenue is going to go up because you're charging a higher price, but your revenue is also going to go down because you're selling fewer units. So make sure you understand that, and when I do the graphical part, it will hopefully make a lot more sense. So let's look at if we assume that the demand curve is elastic, right? So what that means, and hopefully you remember, is the demand curve being elastic is that the curve is very flat, right? So when price changes, quantity changes by a whole lot. So remember that as we do this example. So if the demand curve is elastic, then when I change price, quantity changes by a large amount. So the percent change in quantity is going to be larger than the percent change in price if the demand curve is elastic. And again, you should remember that the number elasticity should be less than -1. So -1.5, -10, or anything that's less than -1 for it to be elastic. So the fall in revenue from lower quantity is greater than the increase in revenue from higher price. And therefore, your revenue will fall. Right, so this is true if the demand curve is elastic, which means if the demand curve is elastic, let me repeat it one more time and then we'll look at it on a graph. If the price goes up, revenue will fall, and conversely, if the price goes down, revenue will increase. All right, so now let's look at all of this on a graph. So let's say your elasticity is -1.8, which means your demand curve is elastic, and you are currently selling 12 units and charging $200, leaving you with a total revenue of $2,400. So if you raise your price from 200 to 250, you will sell fewer units. You're going to sell 4 fewer units in this case. So we will see there are 2 effects that happen. All right, your revenue goes up because you're charging $50 more to these 8 people that are still buying the good from you. Right, so keep in mind these 8 people were initially paying you 200, now they're paying you 250. So your revenue goes up because this region represents increase in revenue. However, you are going to sell 4 fewer units. So your revenue goes down because those 4 people are not going to pay you anything because they're not buying anything from you. So understand the two opposing effects when a price changes and how it's related to elasticity. So you lose revenue because quantity goes down, but you also gain some revenue because price is higher. Now the question is our gain more or less than the loss? And that part is answered by whether your demand curve is elastic or inelastic. So if the demand curve is elastic, then you can see that the loss in area is more than the gain in revenue. So overall, your revenue will fall. All right, so when the demand is elastic, a price increase causes revenue to fall, and conversely, a price decrease will cause revenue to increase. So that's the interesting part, is that if you are operating in a market where the demand curve for the consumers is elastic, then lowering price actually leads to more revenue, which might seem a little counterintuitive, but now that you guys are experts on demand and elasticity, you understand that. Now let's look at the other case where the demand curve is inelastic. Right? And again, you'll see the graph in a second as well. So the demand curve is inelastic. That means when the price changes, quantity does not change by a whole lot. So the numerator is going to change by a smaller percent than the denominator. So if the price goes up, the number of people that buy your good do not decrease by a whole lot. Now you should be able to guess that your revenue will actually go up when you increase prices. All right, so let's look at the graph, and that will make more sense to you. So the demand curve is an inelastic demand curve, and let's say we start with the same exact point as the previous graph. So your revenue is $2,400. Now if you increase price by $50, what you see is that the loss in revenue due to people not buying your good is less than the gain in revenue because you're charging a higher price. So now this region is more than that region, and therefore your revenue will increase when price increases. So this is very important. If you're planning to run a business at some point, it's very important to understand how your consumers that are buying your good behave. Do they have an elastic or inelastic demand curve? Because in one case, revenue goes up if you decrease prices. In the other, revenue goes up if you increase prices. So it's very important that you understand that. So pause this video and answer this question. Think about insulin. Insulin is a medication that is required for people who are diabetic. So they should have a very inelastic demand curve for insulin. So if the price of insulin goes up by 10%, what do you think is going to happen to total expenditures or revenue in this market? So pause the video and do it and come back before I do the answer. So since the demand curve is, you know what the revenue is, since the demand curve is inelastic, if you increase price by 10%, the quantity is not going to change by a whole lot. So an increase in price is proportionally larger than a decrease in quantity. And therefore, your revenue or total spending that consumers do is going to go up. The last thing, and then we'll conclude this video, here's just a summary of what I just concluded, is that if you have an inelastic demand curve, an increase in the price of the good leads to a decrease in quantity demanded that's proportionally smaller, and therefore, revenue goes up. And conversely, if price goes down, revenue goes down. And if the demand curve is elastic, then it's the reverse. If the price goes up, total revenue goes down. And if the price goes down, total revenue goes up. So this is just summarizing what I've done so far in today's video. So I'm not going to go over it in too much detail. You can read it for your own information. So now the last part before we are done with this video is let's look at numerically how we can see the relationship between total expenditure or revenue and elasticity. So this equation tells us that expenditure is equal to, or change in expenditure, is equal to change in price times this fraction, which is Q times 1 plus the elasticity. Right? So if the demand curve is inelastic, that means the elasticity is between 0 and negative 1, then this number is a fraction. It's negative 0.5 or negative 0.8, which means this number is positive. 1 plus or 1 minus a fraction is a positive number, which means this whole side is going to be positive. So an increase in price, if this whole fraction is positive, is going to increase revenue. Now, if on the other hand, your elasticity is less than negative 1, your demand curve is very elastic. Now this term is like -5, -2, -1.5, which means this term is negative. So now this whole term becomes negative, which means if price goes up, total expenditures goes down. Right? So this is just giving you a simple equation which helps you understand how revenue changes when elasticity changes as well. So that's going to conclude our video. So in this video, we just looked at elasticity in a little bit more detail to see how revenue changes when a demand curve is elastic based on price and quantity and the relationship between the two variables. That is going to conclude a very important and large topic on how consumers behave, starting from indifference curves and budget constraints to demand curve, what causes the demand curves to change, and elasticity. So you should be an expert on how consumers behave based on all of those factors. In the next video, we're going to start a brand new topic, which is the producers. Now we're going to analyze how producers behave. So make sure you are comfortable with the consumer side, and then in the next video, we'll start with the producer side. See you then.